Okay, welcome back. This is the second video going over the mesh network in Maya, and on this one we're going to work with more of the mesh distribute. So let's go ahead and get started on this. I'm going to start off with a simple cube. We'll make a polygon cube. I'll make it pretty small. Let's zoom in on this and see exactly what this is. So let's bring it up in the attribute editor. Polycube 1. I'm going to go with the width. Let's just go 0.25. Let's go 0.5 actually. And a depth of 0.5, and we'll just make that 0.075 for the thickness, and I'll leave it at that. But let's change the color on here. So I'm going to select, right click on here, I go down to assign new material, and I'll use an Arnold shader for this, just in case I decide to render it nicely. And I'm going to use a standard AI standard shader or AI standard surface shader here. I'm going to call this one cube underscore matte, and I'm just going to give it a color. So click on here and just go ahead and make it red. And I'm going to increase the weight so it's a little brighter, and I don't need specular color. Well, yeah, let's go ahead and keep that just for fun. Alright, so I'll leave it at that. And I'll hit 6 on the keyboard just to make sure the color shows up on here. So that's going to be the first one. I'll go ahead and rename this one just cube instead of polycube. Next I'm going to create a sphere. So let's go create polygon sphere. And I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, not too big. But let's see what this is. In the attribute editor, if you want to get the same size I have mine, let's go radius of 6. Subdivisions, 20 is fine, so let's leave it at that and just call this the globe. So I'm going to first select the cube, and I'm going to bring up the mesh menu here and go create mesh network option box. Just make sure everything looks okay. And we'll leave it with all the default settings. So just hit apply and close. And now the cube has been distributed in its standard default setting with 10 across. So I'm going to select the first cube here and bring up the attribute editor again. And let's go to the mesh distribute tab. And before we make any other changes here, let's set the distribution type to mesh. Now when you do that, you'll see it opens up some additional settings here like input mesh and things like that, and it's not connected to anything. So let's bring up the attribute editor, or not the attribute editor, I'm sorry, bring up the outliner. So we'll go to Windows, outliner, and you'll see here a list of all the objects you haven't seen. So we want the globe. And I shouldn't have selected it actually. Let's select the cube again so we can see where we're at. And let me go back to here. Back to the distribute. So make sure the cube is selected. Go back to the distribute tab where it says input mesh. And what I'm going to do is middle mouse button, click and drag the globe and drop it into the input mesh option here. So make sure you do middle mouse button, or you'll do what I did and it'll just deselect the cube. So middle mouse button, click, drag, and we'll drop it right into the input mesh here. Now we can close out. And what you can see here is that the cubes now stick to the globe. And actually, let me move that up off the ground. There we go. Now remember, there's only 10 of these cubes. So if I select the cube, it brings it back up in here. We can then increase the number that you want. Let's say we go 100. Distribution type, let's do a method. Instead of scattered, we can choose vertex if we want a little bit more organization. random vertex, we'll keep it on those vertices, every point that you have. Faces, we're going to need more if we want to cover this entire thing, so we can go up here, let's go 500 and see what that does. That's pretty good. Yeah, so you got different options. Here's edge, you can see it's rotating them around in different ways. I'm going to go with probably just scatter for now. Now, this is one piece, one way of actually putting this in. We can adjust all of these settings. If you want to change how they're distributed around, you can apply ramps, things like that. But let's look at some other things. Now we've got some objects here. Let's go back and do what we did in the last video by adding that audio node and see what happens. So click on Add Audio Node. So now we've got two different nodes. We've got the mesh and then we've got audio. Let's see. So let's go into this audio node here and we'll bring in the music that we had earlier. And you'll see there's not a whole lot of change. You'll see a couple pieces here. There's one popping up. If we go ahead and play it, I'm going to drag the audio back onto the timeline so we can hear when things are going on. And let me also increase the timeline, and I'm going to go back to 30 frames per second. So I'm going to type in 1 and 1. And 1. Okay, so let's see what this does. I'm going to drag this all the way out and kind of get an idea what these look like. There's a little bit of movement, not a whole lot. Most of that's because these are pretty narrow objects, pretty thin objects. So let's bring out the attribute editor and see what we can do with this. So just like the last time, we'll go ahead and play around with some of these. Increase the position. We could increase the scale. Let's go 100. And let's go to the strength. And maybe make it a little bit more randomized. Now we're rotating it. Alright, so that's one more piece that we can add to this. Now let's look at some other things while we're in this scene. How many things can we add to this? Let's throw in another object. And we'll go ahead and create a plane this time. I'm going to make it roughly a square. And I'm going to add in additional subdivisions because we're gonna bend this. So I'll go 15 and 15 in both directions, and I'm going to call this just a billboard for now. Now let's add a texture to this. So I'm going to click and well, let's not add texture to this yet. Some of these things we'll go to make we'll make them invisible. Let's move it up here. So in this one, I'm going to create another cube, polygon cube, small like the first one was. Let's go perspective and see. That looks alright. Now let's go ahead and put some color to this again. So we'll go material. Oops. Add and assign new material. Again, I'm going to go with an Arnold shader, standard surface. And let's call this blue matte. And we'll change the color to blue, kind of a bright blue. Alright. And let's get this down on, well, it doesn't have to, we go to the side. Alright, so let's go ahead and tack on a new mesh network to this object. So we're going to do two different ones here. We'll go with mesh, create new mesh. I'm going to leave it the way it was set, the normal default settings. Bring it up here in the attribute editor and go to the distribute. And we're going to call this again, we're going to make this go to a new mesh. So we'll bring up the outliner, find the billboard, here it is. I'm going to middle mouse drag it in so that the cube is now distributed along this. Okay, so what we're going to do with this is we're going to add, instead of just distributing these cubes along the face of this plane randomly, we're going to distribute them based on a graphic. So if you go into the file where the video is, you should find a JPEG image called star2. And we're going to apply that to the object. So first let's select the plane. And what we'll do is go into the channel box editor. So I'm going to close that, go to channel box, and where it says visibility, we're going to turn that off. So just type in off, but don't deselect anything. Okay. So with that turned off, let's bring up the attribute editor again. And go down until you find the mesh network that is applied to this object. Now it's applied to this object because we grabbed it and dropped it into the mesh network for the cube. So that's why you see it attached to this as well. So go to mesh, in this case mesh 2, and we're going to add a new node. It's going to be a visibility node. So click down here on visibility and hit add visibility node. So now we're in the Mesh Visibility tab, and what we want to do is go down here to Strength Map and click on the little checkerboard box here, and we're going to add a file, just like adding a texture to anything else, and then we're going to click on the file folder here for image name and browse for that. So you should find star2, which should be a white star with black background. Go ahead, and what's going to happen is the objects, the cubes, are going to go to the parts that are white and define this shape of the star in the way they're distributed. So we'll hit open. Alright, so now that we've got this, you can see the little cubes are starting to take shape. I'm going to go back here into the Mesh Visibility tab, and in the visibility tab you should see this little checkerboard box has turned into a little input letting you know that there is something going into that. Now what we need here is a couple things. First, we need more of the cubes to fill the space, but also we need to define the map helper. And this should be the billboard. If you don't see this in here, if you don't see billboard in your map helper, go ahead and go to Windows, Outliner, and middle mouse button drag that billboard and drop it into that area. Now we should be able to go to the Distribute tab. Going the wrong way here. So I'm going to select the cube, the small cubes here, and go to Distribute, and let's now play around with these objects. So we've got 100 points, number of points, 100. Let's go ahead and make that 1,000. And now you can see that those points are turning into the star shape that we applied in that image. So we could change the method. Let's go with vertex, random vertex, faces, and you know, a lot of these probably, here's a pretty good one with edge. I'm going to go back to, well, let's leave it on edge, and let's increase the number. Let's go 1,500 and see. I don't think there are enough edges for that. If you're going to go with the scatter, you want to go with more, obviously. Let's go with Let's just do 5,000. There you go. And now you can see we've got this going on here. So interesting stuff, fun things that you can do with this. Obviously this can also be animated. You can apply music to this, you can apply a number of different nodes to this, and I would encourage you to just play around and see what kinds of creative things you can come up with in how these things move around. And before we go, let's just do a little fun thing here. We'll go ahead and add a few more things to this. Let's go ahead and put the audio node in here. And then we'll add a deformer too and animate both of them. So let's bring up the attribute editor, go to the distribute. And actually, let's leave that number of points to 5,000. Let's go to the Mash 2 tab and include audio, and we'll go browse for the one that we've got, the one that we've been using, and enter that in here. Let's see what that does before we make too many adjustments to this, but test it. So a little bit here. Let's increase some of the scale levels. Let's go 100 in the Y. Increase the strength. And I'm actually going to, while that's going, I turned it off. What I'm going to do is where it says map helper here, I'm going to go ahead and go to the outliner and drag my billboard and drop it in there. And then let's go ahead and play it and see what that looks like. I think it's a little too much. I'm going to bring these down. Let's go 25. So we've got some audio going on in there. Now let's go stop it and let's add in something else. I'm going to select that star and let's go up here to the modeling menu and we'll choose deform nonlinear, and let's just do a wave file. So with this, I'm going to select the wave. I'm going to go into the channel box and click on wave under inputs here, and we can select any of these, let's say amplitude, and just middle mouse button drag your mouse through the viewport to adjust the settings to that wave. I'm going to go with something a little less crazy here, and with the wavelength something like this, maybe. Yeah, I'll keep the drop off set. There we go. So I just made a few simple changes to this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this object over here and I'm going to find a spot where the music starts a little bit more here. We're going to keyframe that. So I'm going to, with the deformer selected, I'll hit S on the keyboard. Then I'm going to move my timeline down to about frame 600, and I'm going to have it go over to the other side and keyframe that. So now you'll see the deformer moves across. Let's see what that looks like. We'll go ahead and play. And there you go. There's some another thing you can do in there. So we could keep doing that. We could keep animating this. Let's go across here a little bit faster this time. Keyframe that, and maybe come back again. And let's see what that looks like here. Okay, so there you go. There's another couple ways that you can use the mesh network to do some interesting things in combination with your deformers and any other type of animation, really. Any of these things can be adjusted, like for instance the sphere over here. If we want to get rid of that, you just turn it off in the channel box editor by going to the visibility tab and typing in off. And now you can see it's a little more interesting. So if we ended up rotating a camera around this as everything was playing, you see it really gives you a little more of a three-dimensional experience. So that's more of the mesh network, and in the next video we'll do some more, and we'll probably use some spline lines or some CV curves to help animate things around a path as everything else is going on.